Welcome to GlobalPolicyCast, a podcast which opens the inner workings of international governance through conversations with those who have shaped policy from insight to impact. Hosted by Insights International with its co-founder Arpit Chaturvedi and Suresh Kumar, a career civil servant with nearly 40 years of implementing policy on the ground. Global ideas, real governance. Welcome to Global PolicyCast.
In this episode of Global PolicyCast, Mr. Suresh Kumar and I sit down with Dr. Wilhelm Krull and we discuss an interesting topic, the usefulness of useless knowledge. Basically, the conversation stemmed from Dr. Krull's lecture at Uppsala University in Sweden, where he reflected on institutes of advanced studies. A unique setup where you kind of put together a supergroup of academicians, fund them, and, give them nothing specific to do. They eventually have to come out with something great, but they sort of live on an open agenda and surprising things come out of it. Einstein was part of an Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton University, and his students came up with some of the greatest ideas and breakthroughs in relativity, quantum theory, computing, and foundational work that shaped many later technologies, such as modern cryptography, semiconductors, and even the intellectual roots of the internet. Our conversation moves beyond science to ask a larger policy question: what happens when societies stop investing in knowledge without immediate application? What about the usefulness of useless knowledge? Join us in this episode with Dr. Wilhelm Krull and listen on. Thank you, Mr. Wilhelm Krull, for joining the Global Policy Cast. Absolutely looking forward to talking with you. And today's topic is the usefulness of useless knowledge, which is an interesting topic that we would cover many facets of. But first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you. If I may, I can also explain where the title comes from. It goes back to Abraham Flexner, the founder of the IAS Princeton, the Institute for Advanced Study, which is the mother of all institutes of advanced study. And when he looked back at the first 20 years, he talked about the usefulness of useless science, clearly explaining that, you see, what we consider maybe as just theoretical work or theorizing about certain things may in the long run have a much greater impact than those things that we consider as more useful and particularly applied research and development. So let's say strengthening the knowledge base, and that is one of my convictions as well, is extremely important if we want to keep the capacity to renew and to reinvent things or reconfigure things even, so that we are prepared, let's say, also with an influx of new knowledge all the time.
Absolutely. And that is something that we would love to deep dive into today. Before we do that, could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up working at this intersection of academia, finance, the corporate world, as well as the nonprofit world? What led you to this?
Well, originally, of course, I started after my PhD teaching German and politics at the University of Oxford. Mm-hmm. And after 4 years, I returned to Germany, and me and my wife established a family of 3 children. And then I taught for a while at the University of Bonn. And then I got an offer to work for the so-called Science and Humanities Council, the chief advisory body to the federal and the state governments. And although I, at the beginning, considered that as an experiment, it later on turned out to be just the right decision to make, because what nobody foresaw in 1985 was, of course, that 5 years later, the Berlin Wall would come down, and the decisions, or let's say, first of all, the concepts and strategies had to be developed for German unification. And that brought me at the age of 35, 36 in a situation where I was then, let's say, also able to develop a kind of concept for unifying 2 totally different systems, a centralized system modeled according to the Soviet system in East Germany and a federal system in West Germany. And how can you reunite that by, let's say, developing also pathways towards a more unified system? And that then also led me to South Africa. And of course, I had to explain that that's a very different kind of thing to unite two systems within one country, or to have the majority of people taking over the power from a formally suppressive government. And that's why, let's say, it was quite a different challenge. But these kind of, let's say, transformations of research systems or research institutions has been one of my tasks almost all over. Also then with the Max Planck Society in the early 1990s, again, establishing institutes in East Germany, and as of 1996, running the Volkswagen Foundation, the largest private research and higher education funding foundation in Germany. And after that, I still had an opportunity to set up a new Institute of Advanced Study in Hamburg. But since 2023, I'm now more or less self-sustaining at providing advice to research institutions. But also, I was already in 2003 approached by Deloitte Germany to join their supervisory board, and in 2018 by the Educational Testing Service in Princeton. So you see, it's quite a wide variety of different institutions, but let's say the common denominator is always quality and innovativeness and the readiness to actually proactively confront the changes needed.
No, absolutely. Thank you for giving us an overview of that fascinating career. And just for the benefit of our audience, if you could throw some light on what are these institutes of advanced studies? What do we really mean by that?
Well, institutes of advanced study are, let's say, really islands within the research systems that provide to some of the most creative minds time and space to thoroughly rethink what they have been doing so far, but also to jointly with other colleagues come up with new ideas and new solutions. It's in a way also a response to the mass higher education situation in most countries as far as the universities are concerned. So for instance, in Germany, most universities that applied and successfully applied for the status of University of Excellence had in their application the launching of such an institute. And in many cases, the reasons are allow some of our best people, or particularly also bring some of the best people from all over the world to our university to add to the wider spectrum of creative minds and to enable, let's say, the creation of some new concepts, new developments. And as one colleague of mine once called it, such an institute should be a breeding ground for new ideas. So that really, let's say, the sparkling of ideas is something that is really at the forefront, and that these people have usually a year or so to really step out of their routine and to look into totally new things. So as Abraham Flexner already envisaged almost 100 years ago at Princeton, it should enable the most creative minds who are also extremely committed to their research to really decide by themselves what they want to do and how they want to go about it. And in many respects, let's say, these kind of concepts have also been adapted, although they are more close to theoretical sciences and to the humanities and social sciences, for experimental sciences. If you look at the basic principles of Max Planck Institutes, they are also providing some of the best researchers in the world with the best possible opportunities to pursue their ideas and to be supported by top-notch infrastructure so that really breakthroughs can occur. And as you know, breakthroughs is such a high-flying word that I always say, well, most people will only be able to go underneath it, but not really achieve breakthroughs. And I always say groundbreaking research is already quite an ambitious thing. But as I try to explain, it's really this freedom to really also trust these researchers that they will not just go to the theater or the opera during that year, but that they will also thoroughly enjoy meeting other colleagues, getting new ideas, and also maybe following different paths afterwards, which is also quite something institutes of advanced study are about.
Sure. And Princeton was kind of, is it right, the pioneer of setting this up, and Albert Einstein was hosted at Princeton's Institute of Advanced Studies. A lot of our listeners are public policy practitioners. So just wondering why public policy people should care about having these institutes of advanced studies in a particular country, and what was probably the origin of the Princeton one? What was the policy angle over there?
Well, for Princeton, of course, it was basically Abraham Flexner who did several studies for American foundations. The one he's most famous for with respect to health research and health policymakers is, of course, his study of European biomedical and clinical research in the 1890s to 1900s. And when he came back to the US, it was pretty clear what he recommended in order to uplift the then rather meager status of American clinical and medical research by telling them how, for instance, the then already quite well-known Charité in Berlin had its strengths because of combining clinical caring for patients with research on the same floor. So that it's just one or two doors away. And so you'd say the clinical people can also gain enormous insights from participating in scientific research, and then finally also being able to conduct that. That enabled him, and the credibility he got for that, to propose an Institute of Advanced Study in the early to mid 1920s to some private funders, and explaining why he thinks that that is the best way to really get new ideas into the system. And he managed then to establish it around 2030, in particular, of course, with the background of the Albert Einsteins, John von Neumanns, and others, unfortunately being forced to leave the German system. As you probably know, Albert Einstein was even one of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's directors or Max Planck directors, and he was, of course, by then already a Nobel laureate.
Yes.
But you see, with these kind of people, Abraham Flexner could immediately demonstrate how effective this kind of, sometimes by policymakers considered luxurious environment, is actually be so fruitful, and that it really has a huge impact on enlarging the knowledge base of humanity. And that was, of course, the starting point. And when later on, Abraham Flexner, when he also, discussed this notion of useless knowledge, seemingly useless knowledge, one should say, that he then said, what we planned in the 1920s was very good, but what we now have is far better than I ever thought it would be. So it was clear that given these people and these creative minds using all their talents in order to make it happen, to produce new insights in science, and particularly in theoretical physics, but also in other domains, that was, of course, the starting point. And then it took quite a while until the 1960s, that also when new universities were set up in many countries across Europe to start with, but also in other countries, as far as I can see, then in some cases, people said, well, you see, in order to build a creative kind of interaction among and across disciplines, it's probably useful to have, as they called it, for instance, at the University of Bielefeld, a Center for Interdisciplinary Research, more or less an Institute for Advanced Study that would then, let's say, encourage people to also take time off out of their disciplinary work and to actually rethink and reconfigure the way they conducted not only research, but also education or training of students. And in that respect, of course, always these kind of diversities and interactive notes are absolutely crucial if you really want to achieve something outside the box.
Yeah.
And that is why I think it's so necessary to have similar institutional setups. And that's why so many universities across Europe then in the 1980s and 90s also decided to set up what they now call university-based institutes of advanced study. Mm-hmm. Whilst, of course, the Princeton one and the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin and similar ones are non-university institutes of advanced study, they also have a much wider mission. So they invite people from all over the world, and they may have occasionally focus groups, but the basic idea is to bring the best minds together to enable them to either write their new book in the humanities or to pursue some new theoretical ideas. And that is actually what then stimulates also, of course, new lines of research within universities. And by, let's say, bringing fresh ideas to the universities, you do a much better service to the research and higher education system than by simply leaving people wherever they are. So this, let's say, this impetus of new ideas and this input into the higher education and research system is really why such institutes of advanced study or centers of advanced study, whatever they are called, are so important. And that's why even, of course, you could say, given the scarce resources in South Africa in the 1990s, we nevertheless, and finally also Nelson Mandela agreed to establish an Institute of Advanced Study, in this case at Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch, of course, being a university that had a strong Afrikaans kind of orientation, but one that, of course, also was quite aware of the fact that they needed to change and that they had to adapt to the new environment. And this institute, of course, was not just one for the University of Stellenbosch, but for South Africa. And meanwhile, there are new ones also, for instance, at the University of the Western Cape, the formerly colored university. And when you talk to them, they all will testify to the benefits for their system and for also, finally, for the young junior researchers and for the students themselves.
No, absolutely. And fascinating topic. I would, have a lot of questions, but let me first give it over to Mr. Suresh Kumar. I'm sure he would have a lot of questions, and looking forward to hearing from you, sir.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Apil. Thank you, Wilhelm. You said it right, that institutes of advanced studies are meant to create the knowledge which is unusual, which is not existing, and which is of high order. This kind of a objective is very well taken. But unfortunately, when it comes to policymakers, you said it, they consider it a luxurious kind of an activity or a luxurious structure, which many in our country particularly believe we cannot afford to do it. But one of the issues we in the civil services and in the policy-making level, we've been facing it as and when we discuss to establish institutes of advanced studies, institutes of higher learning, or even the universities and institutes of higher education. One of the issues was that most of these institutions were looking for autonomy, functional autonomy, financial autonomy, and they wanted to be on their own to do something creative, something extraordinary, maybe for the nation, for the people they were catering to or they are servicing. But the fact is, in the policymaker level, we considered that kind of a freedom, autonomy as dangerous. Do you think the institutes of advanced studies with whom you have interacted, or some of you claim that you have set up, do you think they still have the kind of freedom, autonomy they need? Or they are still struggling with the policymakers? And how do you reconcile the mindset the policymakers have, particularly in less developed countries, maybe in many developed countries also? How do we reconcile this position that the experts, the researchers, the scientists like to have institutes of advanced studies, like to create something unusual, but policymaking, the policies are somehow taken as a bottleneck? That's one thing which bugs me. And the policymakers' viewpoint is that you may be private. You want me, yes. You want freedom, yes. But at the same time, you have to be accountable. You have to be transparent. The foremost questions in the bureaucracy are in governments. I've been in government for over nearly 4 decades. The foremost question which had always come to us, and mainly from the political side, that if we give them functional autonomy, financial autonomy, and leave them on their own, will they be accountable? Who will regulate them? How will you ensure transparency? How will you ensure nothing goes wrong? How will you ensure that the public purpose, the public intent of setting up these institutes is carried out effectively? Over to you, Will.
Yeah, I fully understand what you're saying, because also to my experience in several cases, particularly representatives of governments or ministries are very suspicious of what these academics do anyhow. You see, fairly often they say, well, you see, these people, these professors, for instance, they have 5 or 6 months of free time a year and they get more money than I get and all the rest of that. So it's absolutely necessary to, first of all, build trust. And you can only build trust if you can demonstrate that something is actually of public benefit. And otherwise, you see, you shouldn't pay for it. But you see, autonomy is not complete independence. As I always like to say, independence and interdependence are 2 sides of the same coin. So being autonomous as an institution does not leave you alone with respect to all the decisions you take. There should be a governing body that oversees the activities. The leadership of the institute should have, as I like to call it, full operational autonomy. By the way, I'm currently involved in discussing that for an institute in Princeton, that it should have operational autonomy, and that is to say, the leadership of the university or the leadership of this institute or the leadership of a Max Planck Institute should have complete freedom in how it wants to spend the money within the framework of its own mission. So that it has, as I always like to say, it has no excuses vis-a-vis the accountable institutions to say, I was impeded by this or that obligation or something. So that's why I think operational autonomy is absolutely crucial. But oversight and also the responsibility vis-a-vis a governing body is something that should be in place as well. Nevertheless, the question is, what do you do in order to have the right checks and balances? That's, by the way, a discussion we always have also in the German excellence strategy. And for that, it's absolutely crucial that people understand that this freedom you give to them is not to just do whatever you like, but it's always bound to the mission of the university, to the mission of this Institute of Advanced Study. And every 2 years, there should be, as even with Max Planck Institutes, there should be an advisory council or committee, whatever you call it. In the Max Planck setup, it's called a scientific advisory board. That will come along for usually 3 days, look very thoroughly into the research performed, the results, and also into the plans for the future. And every 7 years, there is a kind of systemic evaluation, not with the same kind of advisory body, because you see, in the long run, that was at least my experience in various institutions, in the long run, an advisory body will more or less become friends of the leadership of the institute. Sure. Because you see, once you have given advice 2 or 3 times, and the leadership has more or less been following your advice, then, of course, what can you say? You can no longer say you're on the wrong track. You can only say, well, you see, maybe I myself was wrong in this or that direction, but people usually don't like to do that. Yeah. That's why it's so important that you have a framework whereby, on the one hand, as I said, operational autonomy is granted to the leadership of the institute so that it's being completely responsible for what's going on within the institute. But on the other hand, also it has to report to an oversight committee or to a supervisory council so that the checks and balances are still in place. And then I would say policymakers or administrators that are still suspicious of the many privileges of researchers should finally realize that usually these people work many more hours than the 40 hours usually done by an administrator. So in that respect, I think if it's getting across to these people that this is not just an end in itself, but it's an end towards creating substantially new knowledge or even achieve let's say, groundbreaking results in disciplines. And the groundbreaking results do not occur in everyday circumstances. You really need some extra input, and you need also, and that's what we currently discuss for many universities, you need a much broader international diversity in the setup of the institute or the university, so that you have students from various places and not just from the home turf, that you have researchers coming and going from various parts of the world. And that actually enables a much better performance in the end than if everybody were more or less stay in their home turf.
Willem, at this stage you've said it, but I'll still give you three sets of arguments which as a bureaucrat, as a civil servant, I've always been confronted. As and when we discuss the concept of functional autonomy, financial autonomy, building the institutes of higher learning, institutes of advanced studies. First was, private is not all that private. Whether they may be privately funded, they may be promoted and set up, established by a private or a non-governmental organization, maybe a corporate organization. But the counter-argument from the policymakers at the political level was private is not always private. It is not all that private, and no private institute, and no private organization can ignore what we call is public intent, public purpose, or for that the public good. So institutes of advanced studies cannot ignore that. This is one set of arguments I've always been given by at the policy-making level, be that the political people, the political executives. Second set of arguments are more political in nature. One is politics of policy-making. When a politician comes to government, he brings in politics. And that politics is based on his political agenda, his political ideology, his political philosophy. Now, that politics impacts the policy making, and in turn, it also impacts the establishment of institutes of advanced studies and institute of higher learning. And third is, when this argument of politics of policy making was given to the experts and the scientists and the researchers, they came out with an argument of politics of expertise, that experts will always claim exclusiveness, autonomy, and they would like to remain in their own silo to claim that the knowledge they create, the knowledge they have, is perhaps not vested in the bureaucracy and in the political executives. Now, these three sets of arguments are not that they can't be controverted or they cannot be defended or proposed, but the fact is, these arguments keep up and are raised again and again, and as a result, the policy making suffers. So how do we bring the policy makers, the scientists and experts together, that policymakers, who basically in Indian context, they are the politicians in government, and bureaucracy only plays, civil servants only plays a backroom boys and their supporting role. And policymakers and the scientists, they come on the same table. I'll give you the example from not from the field you are in, but the field I have been working in, the agriculture. Now, the scientists and the technocrats tell me not to give free power, not to give free water. Try and see, give rational subsidies. If at all you have to give rational subsidy, give a rational subsidy on fertilizers, agrochemicals. But what's happening on the ground in most states, maybe 30 out of 32 states in India have free power, free electricity for the agriculture. We have free water supplies. We have huge subsidies on fertilizer. As a result, there is a kind of non-judicious use of fertilizers and agrochemicals, which is impacting not only the quality of food production, but also the human health. So what science tells me to do, the policymaker does not agree. The politician in power does not agree. So how do I bring two together to see I get the best results for the common man? Willem.
Well, I would say the worst thing that can happen is that bureaucrats think they know better where to do and what to do in research, and then even to think they can define the research programs. You see, again, checks and balances are, in my view...
I can interrupt you, Willem, I can interrupt you. This myth exploded during the pandemic COVID-19.
Yeah.
After the pandemic, bureaucrats do not believe that researchers know nothing, because that is the time when the experts, the technocrats, the health scientists, they all proved their work. And bureaucrats, though they were helping and making the policies, they were deciding very quickly, but they were totally dependent on experts and scientists. So that myth, the COVID-19 exploded. Bureaucrats, particularly in Indian context, I can tell you, they no longer think that the expertise is not required. Scientists are not required. It is just how do we reconcile the position of the two?
Yeah. But I think the only argument we can take forward in order maybe to make them interested in the creation of new knowledge is that when you only focus on applying knowledge, there will soon be no new knowledge to be applied. So it's absolutely necessary that you have this openness. On the other hand, of course, I would not say that there is no legitimate demand by politics and policymakers to go for certain applied research programs. You see, we have them in Germany too, but they rest on the pillars of, let's say, what is being done in the universities, in the institutes of advanced study, and then you can move from there towards, of course, you see, we have so many urgent things, let alone health research, climate change, environmental degradation. Also, in the social sciences, social inequality. How do we overcome these huge and increasing inequalities in most parts of the world? Also, by the way, here in Germany, the debate has just started also with respect to the generational conflicts, but not just them. So what I'm saying is, of course, the German government, as well as the European Commission, they have programs. And apart from the European Research Council, all other programs at the European level are more or less application-oriented or even applied research and development. That's, by the way, how it started, given the fact that at the European Union at the beginning was called a European Economic Community. So it was clear that the benefits to the economy would always be at the forefront. But when you talk about innovation and application, it's pretty clear that the local and the regional knowledge are extremely important. So what we did in Europe was more or less turning things upside down. Let's say the agency looking into the developmental kind of work was sitting in Brussels. The researchers were in the south of Italy or Greece or wherever they were on the periphery. So it didn't really have an interaction. And what is absolutely necessary is, of course, before you also, I would say for India and other countries, before you define a huge government program, you should not just have a top-down approach, but should have, let's say, a fruitful interaction, bottom-up, top-down. Finally, of course, I would say every government that is or has been democratically elected should have the right also to set priorities. I'm not against that. But then again, once you make the grants, you should be aware of the fact that you should not be the one to actually then provide the excuses for not reaching the goals. You see, we have seen that on several occasions in Europe, that when you get, let's say, a certain amount of money taken away because of some urgencies, or right now there's again a debate because of the Russia-Ukrainian war and the Palestinian-Israeli conflicts and others, that maybe money would have to be directed to other priorities. But then you should clearly see that once you take away that in the middle of a project, that is then probably not coming to any useful results. So what I'm always arguing for is that you need a high trust climate of interaction between policymakers, politicians, and researchers, and particularly also research organizations. And only if that works, you can have a healthy research system.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example from our national policy making systems. Now, this again, the example relates to agriculture. In the years when Green Revolution was being chased and country was planning for more food, country was attempting to grow more food to kind of reduce dependence on the import of food. So one question came up in the national parliament that how do we reduce our dependence on the import of food, particularly import of wheat from USA. This was in the context of the PL 480, the agreements we had signed to import wheat worth, the food grains worth about $4 billion. Now, when the question came, our union, the National Agriculture Minister was Dr. C. Subramanian. He was a PhD himself. He was a very well-educated, very polished gentleman, of course, a politician. So he called the senior-most technocrat, senior-most scientist in the agriculture, the National Agriculture Commissioner. So when National Agriculture Commissioner gave him some solutions, suggesting we should get more hybrid seeds, we should get more quality seeds, we should increase area under production. But all that would have taken time. Till such time that would have happened, the nation would continue, the country would continue to import food. So the minister didn't like it. So he called the other commissioner or the other scientist to give him as a reply which he could give it to the national parliament. The other scientist also, other researcher also gave him a reply on the similar lines, improve the quality of supplies of fertilizer, agrochemicals, increase the area under cultivation, bring in more things. He didn't like that reply also. He said he can't face the parliament, he can't face the member of parliament with these kind of replies. So he called the bureaucrat, the Secretary of Agriculture, the National Secretary of Agriculture. He's a civil servant from Indian Administrative Service. And I know the gentleman. He's passed away because it's a good old story of 70s and late 60s and early 70s. He called the bureaucrats. He explained the problem. The minister explains the problem to a civil servant who is the National Agriculture Secretary. He says, this is the question, how do I reduce the dependence on the import of food grains from US particularly, or overall imports, food grain imports. So he said, sir, have you consulted? He says, I have consulted the National Agriculture Commissioner. I have consulted the Director General of Indian Council of Agriculture Research, but I am not satisfied with their reply. The secretary tells the minister that give me all the replies and draft replies you received and give me half an hour, I'll come back to you. Exactly half an hour later, the national secretary goes back to the minister with a proposal that we should introduce subsidy on seeds for food grains. We should introduce subsidy on the fertilizer. We should introduce subsidy on agrochemicals. We should give greater marketing incentives to the farmers and agriculture, wheat growers and rice growers. Minister jumped on it. Minister liked this. He said, yeah, this is what I was looking for. And he took that reply and presented it to the parliament. He got appreciation. But the country till today continues with those freebies, those subsidies. And the subsidy budget of the national government is rising every day. Free water, free electricity, free seeds. And I can tell you, I'm sitting in a state. I have worked for a state which was kind of the state which initiated the Green Revolution. We have the quality human resource, we had the quality water, quality soils. We could have done much better without subsidies. With free water, free subsidized fertilizers, agrochemicals, and free water and free electricity, probably the soil quality is going down. The quality of food grain is going down. The health standards of the farmers is going down. We are getting into many more problems which is not easy to explain. The fact is,
what
science said, what the scientists said, what the technocrats said was overruled. And science is always ignored by the policymakers, even today. That's what worries me, that why should we not respect expertise and science in particular? How can you say no to science? Because science is something which is a proven fact. You see, what I may do may not be proven with the fact. What you come up through research is a proven fact, and science cannot be ignored. That's
Mr. Kumar, I think really, if I could frame this and add to what Mr. Kumar has been so impassionately arguing about, is that Willem, you would have also probably seen this in other developing countries. I feel that the time horizons of the public and the policymakers are super short, and they need very quick results. But on the other hand, research takes more patience, and it really operates on this luxurious time horizon. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I
But
think
Arpit, at the same time, if we as bureaucrats or policymakers get into short-term decisions and avoid the long-term implications of our decisions or our policies, we are probably taking decisions or doing something which is non-sustainable. And that's why the way the present agriculture operations are done in the green revolution states of India, they are not sustainable anymore, and the country and the state is getting into more and more difficult situation.
yeah, you see, on the one hand, it's pretty clear that as a politician or as also an administrator, you cannot afford to do nothing when a crisis occurs or when something is, let's say, out of balance. But the worst thing that can happen is to fall into what I call the trap of short-term thinking. So you see, let me have a solution, and at best already yesterday, but let's say at the latest tomorrow. And the result is usually suboptimal, particularly if you enter then into, as we have done in Germany also on numerous occasions, into providing subventions to all kinds of players in the system. The next group will also hold up their hand and say, well, give us something else so that we can also, for instance, currently come to terms with the high energy prices, And whenever you start this, the next lobby group is at your door and will also knock on your door and say, hello, why can't you provide us with something? And getting rid of these kind of policies is extremely difficult, even for a new government. Often they will have to continue because, again, there are lobby groups around parliament, etc. But in research, you, of course, are fully right in order to say for the health crisis like the COVID pandemic or for, let's say, an agricultural crisis, it's absolutely necessary to try to aggregate the existing knowledge as quickly as possible. We are currently discussing, I'm also chairing the Senate of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Science, if we could not, as a lesson from the COVID pandemic, establish something like a network of experts that could respond to future crises. So let's say, apart from climate, health, and other areas, to have this kind of database, which will then enable you to much quicker aggregate those experts who hopefully can then say something about the possible opportunities for the politicians or for other players in the system to do the right things in also, let's say, a fairly short time. But that's a very different ballgame from providing new knowledge, providing also, let's say, new ideas for startups or for all kinds of other applied research and knowledge transfer kind of opportunities. But we shouldn't forget, you see, when we look at the current situation, that in many countries we are confronted with what some called neo-nationalism, others call popularism, or even the new tendency towards autocratic regimes. And in order to come to terms with that, there is also another element in it, and that is to say, we have to connect much better to our citizens. So the communication and the interaction with people from other domains of society is so crucial for gaining also in credibility and also in, let's say, providing ideas for new solutions. I always get nervous when scholars and scientists claim that they know anyhow much better than anybody else. You see, as Max Weber already said over 100 years ago about the role of the politician and the role of the scientist, it became clear that he acknowledged the politician and the policymaker, they have to act fairly quickly and within the time limits of 4 or 5 years, depending on the electoral system. But for the scientist to then immediately take sides with one party or the other is just the wrong track, because then he tries to also direct his own research in a way that is sometimes at least misleading him or leading him into something which cannot be verified in an objective manner. So I think, to put it short, as researchers and research policymakers, we should be active, but we should not be activists.
Yeah.
So that it becomes
Same
clear.
time, Wilhelm, my experience is slightly different. In about 4 decades, in both the national and provincial level, I found that the intellectuals and scientists were most uncomfortable when they were dealing with the politicians and bureaucrats. They didn't have the confidence. They didn't have the confidence to call spade a spade when talking to a politician who was responsible for policy making. So it is probably one of the new imperatives of governance that we should make our scientists, our researchers who create new knowledge, who create extraordinary knowledge, who create knowledge for the benefit of the common man or our citizens. We should make them comfortable. And in governance particularly, whether it is governance of institutes, whether it is governance of a state, whether it is governance of any organization, once they feel comfortable, probably they will deliver better results than what they are doing possibly now.
Yeah, but in your case, then the challenge is how to make them feel comfortable and how to build trust so that these people, whenever they are asked for advice, do not somehow fear that they run the risk of being discredited, and of course, what I always emphasize is the researchers should not become lobbyists of their own affairs. Once you ask the same group for advice, let's say right now in digitization or in AI research, what will they say? They will always say, put more money into my research. Sure. But that's why it's so crucial.
They should not indulge in what is called as politics of expertise.
Yeah, they should not, let's say, shy away from, of course, saying what they think is helpful and is needed. But let's say there it should be clear that there are checks and balances in place which make sure that this is not a lobbying affair all through the stages of decision making, and that it's clear that nevertheless these people can provide useful advice on, for instance, in particular, providing the infrastructures for the implementation of AI-based new facilities, et cetera. But whenever, let's say, these people are just talking in their own interest and pretending that they are still talking as scientists, then that's the wrong track. In Germany, we like to distinguish between academic freedom, in German Wissenschaftsfreiheit on the one hand, and freedom of expression, so Redefreiheit on the other. And I think it's important that whenever